Hi, welcome to Crime Clueless. We're your hosts. I'm Jenna.
And I'm Lara.
The case I have for you today starts with a car, not a dramatic high speed chase, not a roadside breakdown, just a car parked awkwardly on a narrow mountain road in southeastern France. Engine off, windows shattered, bullet holes spidering through the glass. It's September 5th, 2012. The setting feels almost peaceful. A forested road above Lake Annecy, the kind of place cyclists ride for the views and tourists stop to take photos. And for a while that afternoon, nothing about the car stands out until someone gets closer. Inside, there are bodies, four of them, two in the front seat, one in the back, and a man lying on the ground just behind the vehicle. And somehow, impossibly, two children are still alive.
Wait, there's two kids still alive inside the car?
Yes. And that's one of the details that makes this entire case so haunting. Because what happened on that mountain road wasn't random violence in a city. It wasn't anything organized violence related. It wasn't even a robbery gone wrong. This was a family on vacation in one of the most scenic parts of France. And within minutes, they were executed.
This was an execution?
That's the word investigators would later use because the victims weren't just shot, they were shot with precision, headshots, multiple rounds, close range, the kind of attack that feels targeted, intentional, deliberate. And yet, more than a decade later, we still don't know why. This is the case of the Annecy family shootings. Before that car ever turned onto the mountain road, before investigators would swarm the forest and international headlines would explode with speculation, the people inside the vehicle had very normal lives. Saad Al Hili was 50 years old in 2012. He was an Iraqi born British engineer living in Surrey, England, in a quiet residential neighborhood not far from London. By all accounts, he was intelligent, methodical, and private. He worked in satellite technology and aerospace engineering, a field that would later fuel wild speculation about espionage, classified information. But at the time, he was simply a working professional with a stable career and a young family.
So when you say an aerospace engineer, are we talking like secret government contractor level or like a corporate IT tech guy?
Good question. And that's a really important distinction. And it's one investigators had to clarify quickly. Saad did have experience in advanced engineering, and yes, some of his work intersected with satellite systems, but there has never been confirmed evidence that he was involved in classified intelligence operations. That didn't stop media outlets from running with it, though. The moment engineer and Iraq born appeared in the same headline, speculation kind of snowballed. But the reality of his day to day life looked much simpler. He was married to Iqbal Al Hili. She was 47. Friends described her as warm and deeply devoted to her daughters. The couple had two children together, Zainab and Zina. Zainab was just 7 years old at the time, and Zina was only 4. When I say they were on vacation, I don't mean luxury resorts and international jet setting. They were camping. They had driven from England to France, taking the ferry across the channel and making a family road trip out of it. Their plan was modest: explore the French Alps, enjoy nature, and let the girls experience something different.
So it was just a family camping trip. There wasn't some mysterious, secretive travel situation type thing going on.
Exactly. They were staying at a campsite near Lake Annecy called Camping Le Solitaire du Lac. It's the kind of place where families set up caravans, cook simple meals, and ride bikes around the lake paths. Nothing about their trip, at least on the surface, suggested urgency or danger. Also, traveling with them was Iqbal's mother, Suhaila Al Alaf. She was 74 years old and had traveled from Sweden to join the family for the vacation. By all accounts, she adored her granddaughters and was looking forward to spending time together, before the school year resumed. So, when we look at that car on the mountain road later, it's important to remember who these people were before the headlines really took them down to victims. They were a family of three generations: grandparents, parents, children, doing something incredibly ordinary. And that's what makes what happened next feel so disorienting because nothing about their background screamed danger, at least not obviously.
Were there any tensions in the family or anything that was known?
Yeah, when we talk about multiple generations, that's always a great place to start. And this is where the slow burn part of this case begins. Saad had an older brother named Zayed al Hili. The two had reportedly been estranged for years. After their father passed away, there were disputes over inheritance, and property allegedly created significant friction between them. Their father, who had lived in Spain, had left behind assets that weren't clearly divided. There were reports, though sometimes conflicting, that the brothers had stopped speaking altogether. Some accounts suggested heated arguments, others implied more subtle resentment. But when police began digging into motives, the inheritance dispute was one of the first threads they pulled.
Yeah, a lot of times on paper that can be a clean motive, money, family tensions, all those types of things.
Absolutely. And investigators initially considered whether this could be a targeted killing stemming directly from that conflict. But here's where it becomes complicated. There's no concrete evidence that Saad's brother was involved. In fact, he cooperated with police and has always denied any role. Despite years of investigation, authorities have never formally charged him or even named him as a suspect in connection with the murders. Still, the mere existence of family tension added a layer of ambiguity to what otherwise looked like a random act. And that ambiguity would define this case. Because from the very beginning, investigators had two competing possibilities. Was this a highly targeted assassination, or was it a horrifying coincidence?
That is horrifying for either one of those options. So sad.
Yes, it's so heartbreaking, so sad. And those questions become even more unsettling when we introduce the fourth vigil victim, because the man lying on the ground behind the car was one not related to the family at all. That was Sylvain Mollier. He was 45 years old, a local French resident, an avid cyclist who frequently rode that mountain road. He had left his home that afternoon for a solo bike ride. He just happened to be there.
So he wasn't traveling with them. He wasn't connected. Was there anything that they found wrong with the car? Maybe he had stopped to help them with something and got caught up in this?
Possibly. I don't believe they found anything wrong with the car. So the fact that it's just stopped on the side of the road is interesting.
Mhm.
We also can't find any connection between him and the Al-Hili family. He wasn't related to them. He was simply riding his bike in the same place at the same time, and he was shot multiple times, which immediately complicates the narrative. If this was an assassination targeting, say, maybe Saad, why kill a random cyclist? Wrong place, wrong time? Sure, possibly. If this was random violence, why execute the family with such precision? And why and how did two children survive? But before we walk through the timeline of September 5th, before the gunshots and the forensic details, we need to understand what the day looked like in its earliest hours because nothing about that morning indicated what was coming, which frankly is also terrifying.
Yes, for sure.
The Al-Hili family woke up at their campsite like any other day of vacation. There were no reported arguments, no known threats, no suspicious phone calls that have ever been publicly confirmed. At some point that afternoon, they decided to take a drive. Their route would take them up a steep, narrow forest road called Chemin de la Condier. It's not a main tourist highway, it's more secluded, winding, elevated, There's limited visibility on this road and only very occasional traffic. Investigators would later question why they chose that road at all. Was it simply scenic exploration? Was it possibly a wrong turn? Or were they meeting someone? There's no clear answer. What we do know is that sometime between 3:30 and 3:40 p.m., their BMW came to a stop on that remote stretch of road, and within minutes, gunfire erupted.
Was it gunfire from both sides? Were they shooting back? Or do we know how it got started?
That is one of the haunting gaps in this case. There were no immediate witnesses to the beginning of the attack. What investigators reconstructed later came from ballistic evidence and survivor accounts from Zainab, the older daughter. Remember, she was 7 at the time, and forensic positioning at the scene.
That's what I was wondering if the older daughter had remembered anything that she could tell them.
A little bit, which we will get into. And then, with the younger daughter being only 4, that's a little young to have too much of a memory or be able to provide too much to investigators. Now, before we step into that violence, we need to pause here because the transition from peaceful vacation to this calculated violence didn't happen in chaos. It seems that it happened with terrifying control. By the time the Al Hilli family's BMW turned onto this road, it was mid afternoon. The road itself isn't wide, it's the kind of steep, single lane mountain stretch where two vehicles passing each other kind of have to negotiate carefully. On one side, there's dense forest, on the other, there's a drop towards a lake basin below. Investigators believe the shooting began sometime around 3:40 p.m. The BMW had reached a small gravel turnout near the end of the road, essentially a dead end used occasionally by hikers and also people that use this road to bike down. For reasons still unclear, the vehicle came to a stop there. And this is where the timeline fractures into theories. One possibility is that another vehicle approached from behind and forced them to stop. Another is that the shooter was already present at the turnout, and still, a third theory suggests there may have been some kind of brief interaction before shots were fired. But what is not speculative is what came next. A handgun was used, specifically a Luger P06, chambered in a 7.65 millimeter parabellum. This is not a common modern weapon. It's a semi automatic pistol originally designed in the early 20th century, most famously associated with World War I and World War II. By 2012, it was considered rare in contemporary violent crime.
So, a World War era gun, that's very specific. Were they able to find anybody who had this type of gun? Was there any tracing on a gun like this?
That is exactly what investigators were looking into. The detail immediately stood out to them because that weapon choice isn't just unusual, it's almost antiquated. It's not a common firearm that you would find with very many people at all. So, to investigators, it suggested either access to older weaponry or someone intentionally choosing something less traceable in modern databases. Ballistics would later show that approximately 21 rounds were fired. 21.
Wow.
That, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That number matters because it indicates sustained intent, not a single burst of panic, not 2 or 3 erratic shots. This felt controlled. The first shots appeared to have been directed at Saad in the driver's seat. He was struck multiple times, including in the head. His wife, Iqbal, was seated in the front passenger seat. She was also shot multiple times, again with at least one fatal head wound.
So, it doesn't seem that they were just randomly shooting into the car.
No, and that's what makes this case so confounding because that pattern suggests precision. Investigators believe the shooter approached the vehicle and fired at close range through the windows, which to me then makes it seem like there wasn't a conversation happening or any kind of confrontation unless it did, and then they rolled the windows back up to get away.
And it doesn't seem like just a drive-by thing, like, because if you're saying they got out and went to the windows
Mhm.
or got out and walked, because they would have had to kinda walk around the car, I guess, depending on where the shots were.
Yeah. Some shots were delivered after that initial barrage, which is where the execution style aspect comes in. Like they had shot and then made sure that they had those fatal last shots. The positioning of the bodies indicated that at least some victims were shot after already being incapacitated. So, like we said, that initial barrage and then more direct execution style shots. In the back seat, 74-year-old Duhaila was also shot multiple times and she did not survive.
Did she have a head wound too, or could her shots have been missed shots from the front too?
It seems like she didn't get the execution style shot that both Iqbal and Saad had in the front, but they wanted to make sure to not leave her as a witness, not necessarily that she caught stray bullets, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
At some point during the chaos, 7-year-old Zainab exited the vehicle. Evidence suggests that she may have tried to run or flee, or even possibly that she was pulled from the car. She was shot in the shoulder and struck in the head, but miraculously, she survived. The bullet that hit her skull did not fully penetrate it. Instead, it caused a severe but non fatal injury.
Wow, that's unbelievable. So miraculous that she was shot in the head and survived.
Yes, it's so heartbreaking that she was left outside the car, critically injured, but alive. Now, meanwhile, 4-year-old Zena remained inside the BMW. During the shooting, she climbed under her mother's legs in the front passenger seat footwell. As the gunfire stopped, she stayed there, completely silent, for hours.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When first responders arrived, they initially believed that everyone in the car was dead. Zena didn't make a sound. It wasn't until police began moving the bodies that they realized this small child was hiding underneath.
That is so heartbreaking. I can't imagine how scared she was hiding under her mom who had passed away at this time. That is so heartbreaking.
It's so sad.
And she was just quiet that whole time, just hiding under her mom. That's so
Yeah,
sad.
I know. It like pulls at my heart so hard. To investigators, that detail told them something critical. It meant the shooter did not thoroughly search the vehicle after firing these shots, because if he had, he might have found Zena, and it's unlikely she would have survived. Which raises another question. Was the shooter in a hurry, or was the mission considered complete once the adults had been shot and were dead? Now, let's bring in Sylvain Mollier. At approximately the same time the family was attacked, Sylvain was riding his bicycle up that mountain road. He was known locally as a dedicated cyclist and often rode that exact route. Ballistic evidence shows that he was also shot multiple times. Investigators believe he either arrived during the attack or encountered the shooter while attempting to pass the stopped BMW.
Do they think he was a witness, or could he have been having a confrontation with somebody when the BMW showed up and they took them out as witnesses to whatever was happening to him?
That is entirely possible. Detectives' leading theory was that he was a witness who needed eliminated. And it seems like, for whatever reason, they've spent most of their focus in the investigation having Saad and possibly Iqbal as the main targets. And I'm not exactly sure why, because to me, and we'll get into it more, but he rode that road all the time. So it makes sense that if somebody was targeting him, they would know that's his route and this is where he usually goes. The family had never been on this road before. And from what investigators could find, it seemed more like, what should we do today? Oh, maybe we'll go on this scenic drive and see these pretty views. Sounds like a good plan. Their route doesn't seem as easy to follow, if
As
that makes
routine.
sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
More
Mhm.
spontaneous what they were doing than what he was doing.
Right. Sylvan was found near the rear of the BMW, shot and lying on the ground. His position suggests he may have been caught in the open. If he came up on the scene mid attack, he would have been a liability or a witness for whoever did this. There is another theory that complicates this further, but we'll get into that in a minute. Let's talk about the scene discovery first. Around 3:48 p.m., so not that long later, if they're thinking it happened at 3:40, a British cyclist named Brett Martin rode up the road and encountered the aftermath. He initially thought the car had been involved in a traffic accident. When he approached, he saw bodies inside and he saw Zainab outside the vehicle. He called emergency services immediately, and by 4 p.m., French police and paramedics were en route.
Did anyone report hearing any gunshots before that?
Some nearby hikers later reported hearing what they thought were firecrackers, but the area is remote enough that immediate response wasn't triggered by that sound alone. The timeline from shooting to discovery appears to be only a matter of minutes. This tells us the shooter left quickly. There was no weapon recovered at the scene, no obvious forensic trail beyond all of these spent shell casings, no confirmed witnesses who saw a fleeing vehicle, at least not clearly enough to identify it. Investigators believe the attack lasted likely less than five
Oh,
minutes to end four lives and permanently alter two more.
yeah.
When investigators began reconstructing the scene, they realized something even more unsettling. The BMW's engine was still running when first responders arrived. That's why they don't think they stopped for car trouble or anything like that. If they did,
Oh,
you probably would have seen Sod out of the car or evidence that the trunk was popped or something like that. They
yeah.
they also found the parking brake was not fully engaged. The vehicle appeared to have rolled slightly during the chaos, which could suggest the shooting may have occurred as the car was even still maneuvering.
Do they think it could have started while they were driving, or do they think they were stopping, like turning around or something?
Possibly while they were still driving. Some forensic interpretations indicate that Saad may have attempted to accelerate or reverse during the first shots, which could explain the awkward final position of the vehicle. And this is where that analytical slow burn begins to deepen. Because once the scene was secured, investigators were left with a series of impossible questions. If this was a targeted assassination of Saad al Hili, why shoot the grandmother and the cyclist multiple times? If it was random road rage, why use an antique firearm and seemingly execute victims with precision? If it was a robbery, why leave valuables behind? And if the killer intended to eliminate witnesses, why leave two children alive? Nothing about this scene fits neatly into one category. And that's part of why this case is still open and has been deeply frustrating for over a decade. When investigators first processed the scene, one of the fastest things they could lock down before motive, before suspects, before any coherent storyline was the weapon profile. Because bullets don't tell you who fired them, but they can tell you a lot about the person who was behind the trigger. The cartridge casings recovered at the scene pointed towards that very specific caliber, 7.65 millimeter parabellum, fired from a Luger P06 pistol. And I want to slow down here because this is one of those details that sounds like true crime trivia until you realize how deeply it will shape the investigation. This Luger PS6 is not your typical modern handgun. Like we said, it's an older design associated historically with European military use in the early 1900s, most famously around the World War era. It's iconic, it's recognizable, and by 2012, it's not something you casually pick up at a corner shop. If someone is using this gun in a targeted killing in rural France, it raises immediate questions about access, intention, and traceability.
So when you say it's rare, are we talking like a collector item or just uncommon for modern crimes?
More like uncommon for modern crime, but it is often found in collector circles, usually in inherited collections or older military stock that's been circulating privately now for decades. And that matters because it points to a more narrow pool of potential access than, say, a common 9mm pistol. It does also complicate tracing. If the weapon isn't tied to recent purchases, modern registration databases, or current criminal networks, investigators lose one of their fastest pathways to identification. Instead of tracing a gun through recent transactions, you're potentially dealing with a firearm that has passed through hands quietly, sometimes legally, sometimes not, for a very long time. And then there's the number of shots. They said 21 rounds fired. And that's not just a lot, it's sustained engagement. Ballistics helped investigators understand something else. This wasn't firing wildly from a distance. Evidence suggests the shooter was close enough to control placement. The shot distribution, especially the fatal head wounds, supported the idea that this shooter was not panicking.
Does that point to like a professional hit person?
It can, but not automatically. And I really want to be careful with that framing because professional hit is one of those phrases that can turn a case into a movie plot. What ballistics can tell you is behavior under pressure. It can suggest composure. It could suggest being familiar with firearms. It could suggest a deliberate choice, but it can't confirm employment. What it does do is pull you away from certain explanations. For example, if this were a simple road rage, the weapon choice and the precision don't fit. If this were a robbery, the sustained headshots and obviously the lack of theft doesn't fit. If this was a random opportunistic attack, the controlled shooting pattern becomes really hard to explain. Ballistics also raise the question of training, and not because the shooter was perfect, but because the sequence appears purposeful. Neutralize the driver, neutralize the adults, eliminate the cyclist. That's a series of decisions made very quickly. And then there's one more critical detail that always stands out to investigators. The children were left alive, not because the shooter didn't see them, at least in Zainab's case, she was outside the car and injured, but that suggests either urgency, interruption, miscalculation, or possibly deliberate choice. And each possibility changes the psychological profile.
Do they think there was more than one shooter?
It's possible, but it seems like every single shot came from the same gun.
Okay. It seems like it would have been hard unless they did the 2 headshots to the driver, the front passengers, Saad and Iqbal. If they had done those 2 shots first, it seems like the others would have been trying to get out of the car, running away, or trying to do something. I mean, if they shot Saad first multiple times, it seems like
And
Iqbal would have tried to get out of the car. You know what I mean?
yeah, I think that's why the first shots were just to incapacitate them and then to have the precision when they couldn't get out of the car. There also could have been other people around with guns that just didn't shoot, but
Mhm.
prevented them from trying to get out of the car.
I still wonder how Zena got up into the front seat and under her mom's legs without
Her
being noticed.
That I'm not sure on, but her mom was wearing this really long, flowy skirt. So she was hiding under that almost as like a tent. And maybe possibly because they're on this slow scenic drive, maybe she wasn't buckled in. It's possible. Maybe she was already on her mom's lap and they saw someone approaching. So her mom said, hide under here, don't make a sound, something
Mm,
like that right before it happened, which is also heartbreaking.
yeah. I was wondering that too, if maybe they could have been out of the car and like running back in if someone came up and trying to get away that way. I don't know. I was trying to figure out how she could have gotten to the front seat from the back and not be
Without being
noticed.
spotted.
It makes sense if she was sitting on her mom's lap, if they were doing just a slow scenic drive.
Mhm.
Maybe she couldn't see. I mean, I've seen that with
Right,
my
right.
kids. Like, I can't even see out the window or whatever. But
So then it would make sense that you kind of pull over to the side. Okay, come up here. The
yeah,
timing of that is wild to think about if that
yeah,
was the sequence of events. But
yeah. I was like, maybe if they were out and they were like, hurry, get back in the car, let's go. But I don't know.
yeah,
That
and
doesn't seem to make sense either. I don't know.
I do like what you said, maybe she couldn't see from the back, or maybe, a 4 and 7-year-old, it's the afternoon, they've been camping, maybe they didn't sleep great last night, so they're arguing, and it's like, "All right, you come sit up here, you stay back with grandma, we'll just separate
Yeah.
you so that we don't all lose our minds." I mean,
Yeah.
something very, very normal, and maybe she'd been up there for a while on the drive, and her mom hurried with that gut instinct to have her hide right then, which is so sad for
Really
Zainab.
sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the ballistics kind of tell us the how, but the kids tell us something about the why. Do you think?
Yeah, exactly. The ballistics paint the competence, they help show investigators the intention. Then the surviving children introduce this uncertainty because either something disrupted the shooter's plan or the plan never included them in the first place, which is entirely possible. That detail becomes important when we talk about whether the shooter had military experience or a tactical mindset, because trained shooters don't typically leave loose ends unless there's a reason. Whenever a crime scene shows this kind of precision under pressure, the controlled shot placement, sustained firing, calm sequencing, investigators naturally ask whether the shooter had formal training. Not because every accurate shooter is military, not because every chaotic scene rules it out, but because training changes how someone behaves when adrenaline spikes. In Annecy, several elements quietly pointed investigators in that direction. First, the order of engagement. If we look at the most likely reconstruction, according to investigators, the driver, Saad, was neutralized first. That makes tactical sense. The driver controls the vehicle. He's the primary threat in terms of mobility. Disabling him prevents escape. Then the front passenger was shot next, and then the grandmother in the back.
So that's not random targeting then. That's almost sequential, right?
Exactly. It appears structured. We don't have any body cam footage. We don't have any surveillance video. The reconstruction comes from the bullet trajectories, the wound analysis, and where the vehicle was positioned. Investigators publicly acknowledged that the shooting pattern suggested composure rather than frenzy. Secondly, the headshots. Headshots are difficult under stress. They require steadiness, proximity, and control. That doesn't automatically mean military experience. Many civilian shooters can fire accurately, but under chaotic circumstances and this very narrow time frame, consistent headshots do suggest familiarity with firearms.
Would police or military training specifically emphasize that kind of targeting?
In some forms of tactical training, yes, the concept of center mass is common, aiming at the largest part of the body to stop a threat. But the execution style shots, particularly if delivered after the initial incapacitation, suggest a desire to ensure fatality rather than to simply neutralize. And that's where the interpretation becomes murkier. Was this tactical efficiency or was it possibly personal? Because there's a difference between stop the threat and make sure these shots are fatal. Third is weapon control. Firing 21 rounds without abandoning the scene in panic suggests someone comfortable operating that firearm. The Luger, while historic, has a unique toggle lock action. It's not as intuitive as modern semi automatics. Handling it smoothly under stress would require at least some familiarity with that firearm.
So it's not just something you're gonna grab and figure out in the moment. They had used this before.
Yes, exactly. And that's important. It doesn't mean the shooter was active military. It doesn't mean intelligence operative, but it suggests this intentional selection and also competence. Now, here's where things get interesting. Some early suspects had military backgrounds. At one point, French authorities arrested, but then later released a former soldier who reportedly had access to antique firearms. The theory was that someone with past service could have easily retained that knowledge and then had access to older weapons. But as always, suspicion is not evidence, and no forensic link tied any military trained individual definitively to the shell casings or the scene. Which brings us to something else subtle. If the shooter had extensive military training, especially modern tactical training, would they have left two living witnesses?
That's what I was thinking about. I was thinking either it was intentional or they didn't notice the little girl in the front and they thought, they had shot the other child in the
Mhm.
head.
Yes, Anna was shot in the shoulder and in the head. They might have assumed she wouldn't survive.
They may have assumed that. And I wouldn't think normally little kids aren't going to be sitting in the front. 4-year-olds aren't normally going to be hiding in the front. If there was a child in the back, maybe they assumed she was the only child there
Yes,
because that is pretty common. Or maybe they didn't feel like they needed to target the children as well.
right.
I
Not
mean, you
part of the
see that a
plan.
lot where kids are left alive. I mean, not a lot
Yeah.
because they're so innocent. I don't know.
Well, and they could have also been only planning on 4. Maybe they didn't know Iqbal's mother was with them. Then you add on the cyclist, that's
Yeah.
5 now, and maybe that's more than they were planning for in the first place and
Yeah.
needed to get out after that, possibly.
Yeah. And maybe they were told for, like you said, and they didn't know there were 2 children.
Yeah, that is
I don't know.
possible. Or maybe it really was just adults, but the fact that Zainab got out of the car and was running, they didn't want her running far, but she wasn't the target. It was just adults.
Was she shot in the car or after she got out? You know?
I believe it was after she got out.
Hmm, interesting. And I wonder if they thought that they had taken her out since she did get shot in the head,
Yeah, that's kind of what I lean towards more than,
intentionally leaving her alive.
yeah. If you were intentionally leaving her alive, you're not shooting her in the head as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder why they didn't check the car more thoroughly though, unless they felt like they had to get out of there. I don't know. What do you think?
Possibly. Possibly. It is interesting when you read cases about, say, a highly trained operative conducting an assassination. They would typically verify the scene before leaving, especially in such a controlled environment with seemingly minimal time pressure. The fact that Zena remained hidden under her mother's legs for hours suggests either the shooter did believe they had gotten everybody, the shooter was interrupted, or for some reason, I mean, maybe they weren't counting on one cyclist and now they're wondering, oh, are more coming through here? Time to go.
Mhm. I thought that too, because they could have. How many rounds does that gun have as well?
That's a great question. A standard Luger PO6 magazine holds 8 rounds. That's the typical capacity.
Typically 8 rounds. That's interesting.
And then when we talk about 21 rounds being fired, that means the shooter would have had to reload at least twice or be carrying multiple loaded magazines.
Mhm. Maybe they were almost out of bullets too.
That is possible.
So if they did think maybe more bicyclists could come along, they didn't want to risk
Hmm.
not being able to eliminate those witnesses as well. And if you figure like a 4-year-old isn't going to be able to tell you as much as a
7-year-old.
adult or an
Yeah. Or
adult on a
adult.
bike.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It is interesting that they would have had to reload multiple times during this.
Yeah. They must have had other magazines.
Yeah. And so if you do 8 and then 5, you've only got 3 more, and you would either have to reload in the middle again or stop here. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Sometimes scenes that look professional at first glance are actually the result of someone who rehearsed a plan but wasn't necessarily formally trained, which is an important distinction. Plan does not equal professional, and competent doesn't mean any kind of formal training.
We have some signs of control here, but also some signs of imperfection too.
Yes. And that tension is what makes this case so resistant to any kind of clean classification. On paper, the shooter appears calm, deliberate, methodical, even, but the incomplete sweep of the vehicle suggests either haste, misjudgment, or I still think it's a real possibility that the children weren't part of the plan or they weren't worried about them being able to identify them.
I also wonder too, maybe the original plan was for Saad and Iqbal to go on this drive by themselves and the kids were going to stay back with grandma. So,
True.
and they were just maybe planning on two people.
Yeah,
And
maybe
then
the
there's all these
girls.
extra people on the bicyclist. It could have been something different that way too that they weren't planning on.
Right. Much more chaotic than they had planned in the first place, knowing it's going to take more rounds, leave more shell casings, everything like that. Here's where we begin transitioning from who had training to how did they approach and how did they leave the scene. Sometimes the exit tells you more than what happened during. When investigators began reconstructing the scene, one of the first things they had to answer was deceptively simple. Where was the shooter standing? Because the BMW wasn't neatly parked, it was angled awkwardly at the gravel turnout near the end of the road. The engine was still running when they were discovered. The vehicle had rolled slightly during or after the attack. That detail suggests movement, not a stationary execution. The turnout itself is really narrow. It's essentially this small clearing at the top of the single access road. There isn't much room for maneuvering. You can't easily turn around without very carefully adjusting your vehicle, which means if another car approached from behind the BMW, space would have been really tight.
So if there was a second vehicle, it couldn't just pull up casually next to them.
Right.
Do they
It would
think
have
they could have been followed up this road and maybe they waited for them to reach the end and then this
possible.
happened?
Right. It's possible that they were following, maybe even from a distance. It's not like you're going to lose them on this
Yeah.
one way, narrow road. And maybe they were waiting for a spot that was more secluded, more out of the way, waiting for them to pull over to look at something and then
Yeah,
made their move.
because they could have followed them from the campsite. They could have been following them all day.
Totally. They could have been following them for a few days, waiting for the right opportunity.
Yeah.
That second car, if there was, and I mean, I guess you could go up there on a bike, but it seems like there was a second car either blocking them in from behind, like they had been followed, or maybe up ahead of them, waiting for them to get to that spot. Investigators believe the family may have reversed into the turnout. Some reconstructions suggest the BMW was either attempting to turn around or had just completed a turn when the shooting began. And if that's true, it opens up an important possibility. The family could have encountered someone at the dead end up ahead. Imagine driving up this quiet mountain road and finding another vehicle already parked at the top. You slow down, you adjust, maybe you hesitate, maybe something feels off. That moment of hesitation can create vulnerability.
Do they think someone could have been there already waiting?
Possibly. There are three main scenarios that investigators considered. The ones we talked about, the shooter followed the BMW up the road and forced it to stop at some point when they decided it was the right place. The shooter was already up ahead and confronted the family when they got to that dead end. And that one almost on the surface, that one feels likely. But then you think about it, what if they had decided not to continue the drive? What if one of the girls got car sick or they started getting hungry, tired, whatever it was? It seems if they were waiting for them to get to that spot, there had to be something else to it where
I wonder.
following them up makes more sense.
Yeah, I was thinking too about them maybe being followed. If maybe they had been feeling like someone had been following them during this trip and then they noticed them following them, but they were trying to get away from them. They didn't know what this road was. They just went up this road. They're get to the end of the road. They're trying to get away and then they come up behind them.
Mhm.
Maybe they were trying to lose somebody if they had felt like they had been following them.
Yes, I think waiting for that car to either turn around, following them from a distance makes the most sense.
Yeah. They hadn't been there before. It's not really a road, like you said, a lot of people go on. Maybe they just like picked a turn off trying to get away from someone they thought was following them.
Yeah, or, sometimes when you're on those, you pull over because you can tell the car behind you wants to go faster than you're comfortable going.
Yeah.
So you pull over to let them drive past, and instead they blocked them in and the
Yeah.
attack happened. And maybe they kept a distance for a long time until they were far enough up and then started being more aggressive,
Yeah.
forcing Saad to pull over. I said three main scenarios. So those are the first two. The third that they considered is that the encounter was accidental. I don't, that doesn't feel, it feels like if it was accidental, why wouldn't you rob them? Why wouldn't you maybe, I mean, even just taking a wallet or a purse? Maybe they didn't have
Well,
anything on them, but
and like you said, like the road rage people, but if it was road rage, it's pretty calculated what they did for it to be a road rage incident. I mean, if they're following them up this road and they're mad, they're not letting them pass. They're going too slow. They're in this state of mind where they're upset with this car for not getting out of their way soon enough or something. I just don't know how you would get out of the car and execute 4
yeah.
people and injure a child for a driving situation. I don't know.
And the targeted execution style shots at the end,
Yes.
especially.
And you just
Agreed.
happen to have this weapon in your car with you.
Right.
That just feels so coincidental.
Agreed.
I don't know.
While something completely coincidental and random would be hard to solve, this feels more planned, more targeted. Now, the second vehicle theory becomes central because there is one witness report. Shortly after the estimated time of the shootings, a motorcyclist was seen in the area. Early reports described a lone rider on a motorcycle leaving the vicinity at speed. The description was vague, dark clothing, helmeted, not enough to identify clearly, but enough to raise alarms.
Was the motorcycle ever confirmed to be connected?
That's the frustrating part. It was never definitively tied to the crime. The motorcyclist became a person of interest briefly, but no public confirmation ever linked them directly to the shooting. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the timing. In a secluded location with minimal traffic, anyone leaving quickly after gunfire is clearly worth examining. Then there's the issue of tire tracks. Forensic teams examined the ground for impressions from additional vehicles. Reports indicated that there were tire marks present, But the terrain, or on gravel, uneven soil, made any kind of clean identification difficult. Without distinctive patterns or clear overlays, proving a specific second vehicle had been present became complicated.
Yeah, it makes sense. The motorcycle makes a lot of sense. It would
It
be easy for
does.
them to get away, turn around and get away. You said it's a narrow road. If their car is there in the turnout, it would have been hard for another car to turn around and get
Mhm.
away. I think it makes a lot of sense. We don't have any CCTV or anything. We don't have a clear vehicle ID. The road itself limits traffic like we talked about. It just feels intentional.
Yeah. I think that's what makes the geography so compelling. This wasn't a busy highway. It wasn't a suburban street with cameras at every corner. It was a mountain access road with minimal visibility and limited exits, which also, when we talk about the motorcycle, if someone is there seeing a motorcycle leave, and the high speed could have been maybe they did see something or they heard the shooting and they were getting out of there as fast as they could. But if someone is seeing the motorcycle, wouldn't they see a second car?
You
We
would
only
think
had
so.
8 minutes between when they think the shooting happened and when that next cyclist came along and called police. I am
Yeah.
also curious if he was able to call. I wonder if any calls to police started from any of the phones from the adults in the car or if it was just too fast and too chaotic.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking, you said that there were hikers in the area. That's the other thing they could have left on foot if they had gotten there on
True.
foot and left on foot. But like you said, it was not a planned thing that the family went there anyway, unless it was something about the bicyclist and they were waiting for him. And I don't know. There's so
But
many
then you have,
questions.
right, like a lot
So many
more
questions.
rounds spent than you would have planned if
Yeah.
you were only planning on one.
I don't know. I feel like a motorcyclist makes the
Most sense,
most sense. The other bicyclists that came up, they didn't get there that much time after the shooting.
right? Just
Do you
minutes
think he would
later,
have seen that someone leaving?
possibly.
Very
Uh,
interesting thought too.
yeah, it really was likely within minutes from when this
Yeah.
happened to when he got there. So you've either got very precise timing or you know that you're not going to have a lot of time in the first place,
Does that
which
road keep going somewhere else, or was that the end of the road where they were?
some reporting says a dead end, but it seems like it continues. It did have limited exits, so maybe the dead end was heading up and there's a little turnoff to see a scenic point, and they got to that, then we're coming back to the main road to either continue up or continue down. But if that's the case, it makes it even more unlikely that they were waiting for them at that point.
Or that the bicyclist would have gone out that way? It seems like if you were biking up
Right.
that road, that was like your routine to bike that road. You wouldn't go off road to a scenic point. You would do your
Yeah.
route and go back home, right?
Right. Because you're doing it all the time. You've seen all the scenic routes probably at that
I'm
point.
just wondering if that other bicyclist was coming up the road behind where they had come, if
So
he
if
didn't,
that's the case,
unless they could have gone further up and he came up behind. I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me either.
right, because at that point, then you only have, say, 12 minutes before police and paramedics are en route to the scene. How are you getting out of there if it's all cordoned off at that point? I hope that if the road did continue, that they would have explored all of that, right? Most of the reporting says a dead end. So I'm trying to figure out how, with limited visibility, limited entrance and exits, how a whole car could have gotten out of there without being seen.
Yeah. Me too. That's what I'm
Yeah,
trying to figure out as well.
that's why the motorcycle does make a lot more sense.
And if it was more like a, not like a full on motorcycle, but more of
Or like
a
E-bike
bike,
type
like an
thing.
e-bike or something, they could have gone some of the biking routes rather than back on the main road. Even like
Yeah.
a dirt bike,
Mhm.
a bike that can handle that kind of ride, but be able to take other routes out of there maybe than the main road that a car would have to come in on.
Right, right. Gotcha. Yeah, like side little windy through the woods type thing.
Yeah.
That would explain a lot. It can do a lot of those tight turns or the narrow, maybe more hidden ways easier, even if it wasn't that specific motorcycle that was seen. It could have been, like you said, something more like a dirt bike that had even more options to exit.
Yeah. I think that makes the most sense to me because how would that other bicyclist have not seen that? If they had come all the way up to the end of the road, they weren't just barely on the road where they could have maybe gotten out within 5 minutes.
Right.
And if it was a car to have to try and turn around and get out of there, someone else would have seen them, especially that other bicyclist that came onto the scene after the fact.
Yes, because he was headed upward. And unless he wasn't on that very main road, he would have passed the cyclist. The timeline is just super tight.
It's so tight, and I don't know how many cars are going up and down there, if maybe he did pass multiple cars on the road,
Maybe.
but it doesn't feel like that's what type of road it is if it's hard to get in and out. Like
Yeah,
you said, it's a mountain access road. It doesn't feel like maybe there's a bunch of cars going up and turning around and coming back.
right.
I don't know.
Yeah. The escape, the way that they exit the scene is just head scratching. You've got no evidence of multiple other vehicles. There's no evidence that there was a getaway car found somewhere else that they managed to make it to. That left investigators asking, did the shooter know this area really intimately? Was it someone local who understood how rarely that road was used? Because if it was somebody from out of town who was following them waiting for their chance, how did they know this was the perfect place?
Yeah, it either feels very smart or very risky at this
Yeah.
point. I don't
Yes,
know.
exactly. I mean, both depending on which theory we're talking about, because the scene shows planning, the geography shows risk, the execution showed investigators' composure, and that just really kept the investigative net wide. If we take this scene down to its simplest form, one fact refuses to sit quietly in the background. Our cyclist, Sylvain Mollier, did not know the Al Hilly family. He was not camping with them. He was not traveling with them. He was not related to them. He was a local French engineer who just happened to be riding his bike on the same narrow mountain road at the same time. The coincidence of that is so statistically uncomfortable that investigators had to consider the possibility that it wasn't coincidence at all.
What do we know about him? Was there anything in his background that might make him the target? I know we've talked about that possibility and
Yeah, the
yeah.
possibility it's interesting because he's a local man. He is, like we mentioned earlier, in a place that he likes to go a lot. He bikes there often. It's definitely plausible. He worked in the nuclear energy sector, specifically in precision metal engineering that was tied to nuclear facilities. That fact alone triggered its own round of media speculation. Nuclear engineering plus this execution style killing equals immediate conspiracy energy. But in his job, his role was technical. There's no confirmed evidence that he was involved in anything classified, any nuclear intelligence, or sensitive state secrets. He was an engineer working in an industrial capacity, but investigators still looked at whether he had any professional conflicts.
Did he have any?
There were reports of inheritance disputes within his extended family as well. There were also discussions about potential financial tensions, but None of it to investigators rose to the level of confirmed threats, and the forensic evidence complicates the Sylvan was the target theory. When investigators examined the shooting pattern, they noticed something critical. The majority of the controlled headshots were delivered to the occupants of the BMW. Sylvan was shot multiple times, but his positioning really suggested that he encountered the shooter just horribly bad luck mid event. If he had been the primary target, investigators feel like the initial confrontation would have been directed solely at him, the family inside the vehicle reacting after the fact.
He didn't have that execution style headshot, did he?
No, not like the others in the car.
It's so interesting because the location, the geography leans more towards him,
Mhm.
but then the ballistics lean more towards the family.
Right.
So it's so hard to know. It kind of feels like the family was the focus, except for the
Yeah.
location.
How do you get there? How do you get out? How did you know they would be there?
Yeah.
Would have had to follow them up.
Yeah.
And I guess if you're on a bike or something, you could have done that at a distance and managed to keep your distance, staying behind the different turns, things like
That kind of
that.
get rid of the theory of the other people there
True.
outside the car.
Yeah.
I don't know. Still makes me wonder why the family wouldn't have been trying to get out of the car, especially the grandma. I mean,
If yeah,
I don't know.
it might have been so fast. It
Maybe
was
it was
fast.
locked because they were driving and she couldn't get it
Yeah.
panicked. You can't get it unlocked.
Maybe they
And
had
they were
child
still
locks on the
moving.
back door, but their daughter got out. So,
Yeah. Well, and the car was still moving a little bit. They weren't parked.
no,
Just that panic. I don't
it could have been those incapacitating shots really fast to where you can't, and then the rest of them are fired. Horrific. If Sylvan approached while the shooter was already attacking the BMW, then he becomes a witness who I'm sure the shooter doesn't want to leave around. This scenario fits the pattern of him being shot near the rear of the vehicle. And if Sylvan was the primary target, why approach him at the same moment this family arrives? The timing would have to be almost impossibly precise. And like we've talked about, it's not a busy road, it's lightly trafficked. Coordinating an ambush at exactly the moment this unrelated British family drives up would require its own version of extraordinarily bad luck. I don't even think a coincidence. I think just bad luck. Investigators did try to figure out if there was any connection. And like we've said, there isn't. As they looked into this, they went through phone records, email exchanges, business overlaps, any shared acquaintances, and nothing ever surfaced publicly. There's never been any confirmed evidence that they knew each other prior to that afternoon. And here's another detail that pulls against Sylvan as the target theory. The brutality directed at the adults in the BMW suggests the personal intent or at least focused elimination. If the shooter's primary objective was Sylvan, the time spent firing into the car becomes harder to justify unless the shooter felt compelled to eliminate all witnesses. But if that were the case, why not then confirm every witness had been eliminated? We've got two children who are left.
know. Just those inconsistencies again.
Yeah. And it just keeps resurfacing. If this were some kind of industrial dispute or the targeted killing of Sylvan, the shooter either made mistakes, was interrupted, or had a different primary objective altogether. Over the years, French authorities did re examine the Sylvan angle. At one point, attention turned towards a property dispute within his family. Investigators even detained and questioned his relatives, but it didn't lead them to anything. That theory, though, has never fully collapsed in the absence of having answers. It's hard to rule anything out completely. But for investigators, the ballistic pattern, that's what gets them and pulls the attention back to the BMW being our primary target. As French investigators struggled to anchor this motive locally, attention shifted back to Surrey, England, to the quiet suburban life that the Al Hilly family had built. If the motive wasn't on that mountain road, maybe it started years earlier. Saad and his brother had that complicated relationship. Their father had emigrated from Iraq decades earlier and eventually settled in Spain. When he died in 2011, so only a year before, he left behind assets, including property that were not clearly resolved between the two. Early media described tension. Some characterized it as a bitter inheritance dispute. Others suggested the brothers had barely spoken in years. Here's where this theory becomes more procedural. Within days of the murders, British police did search Zayed Al Hili's home in Surrey. His movements were scrutinized, his phone records were examined, he was questioned extensively. It tells us that investigators were taking every possibility seriously.
Was he ever formally charged with anything connected to this?
No, despite early suspicion and very public media attention, there's no evidence that placed him in France at the time of the killings, no financial transfers suggesting any kind of hired violence, no forensic ties connected him to the weapon or the region. Disputes over inheritance, investigators know, are unfortunately common. Coordinating an international execution using a rare firearm on this type of secluded mountain road is not common.
So the leap from we argued about property to I orchestrated a quadruple murder in France is pretty big there.
Exactly. Investigators seem to recognize that fairly quickly. There were also some conflicting reports about the severity of the dispute. Some sources suggested that tensions really had been exaggerated by the media, trying to make this an explosive story that they could put on the front page. And it might be more media driven than what was really going on. And if it's true that they hadn't talked for a long time, the dispute probably isn't as explosive. It's probably more through lawyers and kind of on the sidelines.
Yeah.
Here's one issue that detectives had a hard time reconciling. They found no evidence that the Al Hilly family's travel plans were publicly known. Their camping trip wasn't being put out on social media. They weren't posting live updates online. For someone to ambush them on a remote French road, they would have needed really specific knowledge of the family's location, timing, this physical presence in the Alps, access to that specific weapon, and the willingness to eliminate unrelated witnesses. And all of that combined leads to so many questions, but I think it also lifts the possibility that this was over an inheritance dispute.
Yeah, I guess unless someone followed them from England, kind of like we said before, if they had been following them for a while and it ended up at that road.
Investigators absolutely thought that was a possibility. They looked at ferry records, vehicle tracking possibilities, all the border crossings. There was no public evidence tying any family associate to that route. And then there's another psychological detail. If this were a targeted elimination of Saad, say over inheritance or say something about his specific work, why also kill his wife, his mother in law? I mean, they shot the grandmother multiple times. Why eliminate the cyclist as well? The scale of violence exceeds what we so typically see in either financially motivated family crimes or when the focus is really on a single intended victim. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but the pattern just resists clean alignment in any one theory about what this was about. Over time, the British investigative focus on the family members or even people known to the family really diminished. Public suspicion has always lingered because once the narrative enters the headlines, it's hard to retract it fully. In unresolved cases, every unresolved tension always remains on the board. In the immediate aftermath of the Annecy shootings, the investigation moved fast. French authorities sealed the area, forensic teams processed the scene for days. British and French agencies coordinated across borders. They analyzed the ballistics, phone records, other types of communication, emails, texts, things like that. There was urgency, and for a moment, it felt like this would break quickly. But as weeks turned into months, the urgency shifted into something else, a widening circle.
What was the first real development after the initial shock wore off?
Question. One of the earliest notable moments came when investigators detained and questioned that former French soldier we mentioned. They knew he had access to antique firearms, which did include Lugers. And that alone made him a person of interest because they didn't have a lot to go off of. And for a brief period, media coverage surged again. It felt like maybe the ballistic anomaly had led somewhere concrete, but the link didn't hold. There was no forensic evidence tying him to the crime scene, no confirmed presence on the road, no DNA match, and he was released.
Did he know the family at all, or was he just a random person who happened to have this gun?
It seems like he was just a random person who happened to have this gun and some military training, which is rough if that's
That
all we've
is.
got to go off of. Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been so frustrating.
Yes. When I'm sure they're putting it out to the media's probably reporting it on the surface as this really promising lead and we're almost there. But this pattern repeats throughout the case. Another key development involved renewed attention on Sylvan's family. Years after the murders, French investigators detained and questioned his relatives in connection with his own inheritance dispute. Authorities went through all of his financials, every conflict with his family. The headlines said there's hope that there'd be a break in the case, but no charges. They had the motorcycle lead. We know a witness reported seeing a motorcyclist near the scene. And at various points, investigators tracked down riders in the region. They examined alibis, they re interviewed witnesses, but the description was just so vague that it never solidified into any kind of concrete suspect.
It sounds like they just kept circling back to the same few threads, kind of like we are, but
Yeah, exactly. And we don't have a lot of forensics because the weapon was never recovered. So without the gun, you lose one of the strongest evidentiary anchors. The shell casings can tell you the caliber, sometimes the manufacturer, but without the gun itself, matching it definitively to a suspect is just exponentially harder. And then there's DNA. Investigators did recover limited DNA samples from the scene, but nothing publicly confirmed as belonging to any kind of real suspect. Some of the samples were partial, some, frustratingly, were inconclusive. In 2013 and 2014, French authorities reopened aspects of the case, pursuing new angles. They even conducted a reconstruction on the mountain road to re examine the timing and the position, which tells us something important. They weren't confident in any working theory.
so even the investigators weren't settled on one direction how to look at this case.
Yeah, it seems like it. When law enforcement kept reopening the case, it just meant that something didn't sit right internally. In 2015, the case was transferred to a different investigative judge in France. And that's a move that often signals a desire for a fresh perspective, new eyes on the case. The evidence was all reviewed again, all witness statements re examined, alternate interpretations were explored, and still nothing definitive. Years passed. Zainab The older daughter who survived the shooting recovered physically and was eventually able to provide limited recollections. But given her age and the trauma she went through, her memory of the shooter was understandably fragmented. She described a man, but not in enough detail to produce a reliable composite that would lead to even something they could put out.
Was she able to give them any information on the timing? If it started with them before the cyclist came, or she didn't have any of that information?
She didn't. I don't know if in the chaos she didn't realize what was going on. I mean, in my mind, if she's able to have some memories or some identifying features, to me, that seems like she would have remembered coming across someone shooting a bicyclist.
Right? I wonder if she remembers or if she could remember we were here and this person came up to us on a motorcycle or in a car or they were following us. My parents were scared or things like
Right.
little things like that.
That could at least help with the theory and setting
The
them
timeline
on
and things
one
like that.
direction. Yeah. If she does remember that, it hasn't been publicly released, but I hope that they got some questions similar to that more than just what did he look like? Because there's a lot more that could help
Yeah.
with
Well,
the
that's what I was
timeline, with
thinking
the
too.
theory. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the most tragic elements is this case had such an unusual weapon, a controlled scene. It's remote but not inaccessible. We do have surviving witnesses and international attention on the case, but yet no real suspects and obviously no arrest. In 2022, French authorities announced renewed investigative efforts, including modern forensic reevaluation. They were hoping that advances in DNA technology and data cross referencing could give fresh hope to the case. But as of now, over 13 years later, no one has been formally charged. And that's where this case lives today, in suspension. What makes Ansi so enduring isn't just the brutality, even though it is brutal. It's the imbalance. The attack looks organized, but the motive is unclear. The suspects, some look plausible until they don't. The location looks strategic, but also incredibly risky. And every time investigators lean one direction, there's another detail about this case that pulls them back to center.
Is this considered a cold case? Where is it at today?
I wouldn't say cold, more at its core, unresolved. And the most haunting part may be this: the person who pulled the trigger walked away from this remote mountain road in broad daylight and has never been identified. Public authorities confirmed they're reanalyzing everything. Many analysts that have researched this case lean towards one of the two broad theories that we talked about, either a targeted killing involving someone with a personal motive, or it was an encounter that escalated in a way only whoever did this can fully understand.
Do you feel like the investigation has leaned more towards the family being the target rather than the bicyclist?
Publicly, French authorities have not ruled out either one of the angles, but many observers note that everything they have suggests the family was not incidental. So it is interesting that French authorities have never said for sure one or the other. I feel based on their statements, they probably lean towards the Al Hili family, but they spent a long time digging into the Moliere angle as well. The thing is, when the motive remains unclear after this much time, investigators often consider a harder possibility. The shooter may have been someone peripheral, not a family member, not a high profile intelligence person, not somebody who's a nuclear industry insider, maybe someone who intersected briefly with the victims, someone whose connection just hasn't yet been uncovered, or someone whose path crossed theirs in a way that we still don't understand. Four adults lost their lives on a quiet mountain road in broad daylight. Two young girls survived something unimaginable. A weapon tied to another era vanished, and over 13 years later, the identity of the shooter remains unknown. And not because the case lacked attention, not because it lacked resources, but because every path forward seems to end in a contradiction.
That's what really lingers.
Yeah, it
So
is.
many questions.
The Ansi shootings are remembered because they seemingly resist resolution, and sometimes the most unsettling cases aren't the ones with shocking twists and turns. They're the ones that leave just enough logic in place to make you believe they should be solvable, but they still aren't. Somewhere, someone knows exactly what happened in those 5 minutes. And that is the case of the Ansi family shootings.
Wild. So many questions and so many possibilities.
But also so specific and
Yes.
so planned and coordinated, but then also chaotic.
Yeah. It's so wild case.
It
Very
is
interesting.
heartbreaking. And I really hope for those
Tragic.
girls they get justice for their family and for Sylvan's family. He
Yeah,
deserves justice. It's a wide ripple effect in this one.
for sure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Crime Clueless. If you would like to learn more about this case or see the resources that we used to create it, you can head to our blog, which is on our website, crimeclueless.com. We would love to hear what you think about this case or just to connect, or if you have any case ideas that you want us to cover, connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Just search for at Crime Clueless. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and share our podcast. Your support helps us reach more listeners and grow our community. You can find Crime Clueless on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, really anywhere you listen to podcasts. And as always, remember, refuse to be clueless, careless, or caught off guard.
Not today, murders.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.